stands 28. It stands 28 stories high and stands over the city of Volgograd. In World War II, it was called Stalingrad. Below the statue was a memorial to the dead. In that battle, there were 2 million casualties. And by casualties, I mean killed, wounded, and captured. 1.2 million were Russian, 800,000 were German, or as the Russians call them, the Nazis. Of the 800,000, 100,000 were approximately were captured. Only 5% of them ever returned to Germany, and they did not return until 1950. And they were used as slave labor, building apartment buildings primarily throughout the former Soviet Union that had been destroyed during the war. During the Battle of Stalingrad, 90% of the city was destroyed. Today, it has all been rebuilt. It stands on the Volga River. It's an industrial city, and it is one of the major cities in that part of Russia. On May 9th every year, there's a parade that we all see in Red Square, and it's called the Victory Parade in the Great Patriotic War. They don't call it World War II, they call it the Great Patriotic War. And veterans put on their old uniforms with medals, and to be sure there aren't many left, but they are feted throughout Russia and the other countries of the Soviet Union. This is the parade we all see on television in Red Square. This is a bigger view of it with the Kremlin behind it. But even if you're walking in the woods, you're going to encounter a statue of a Soviet soldier, and the plaque invariably will say, "This is as close as the Nazi army got to, in this case, Moscow." So the World War II and its consequences are ever present. My most memorable memory of the Russians and World War II is I was at a cocktail party and a woman said, "I want to make a toast to peace." This was in 1988. And she told the story of being 10 years old in 1942, living in a village south of Moscow. The Nazi army came through. Her and her mother went into the basement and hid and were not discovered. The next morning, she went out onto the street and she said, "I looked up and down the street and I saw many of my classmates hanging from trees." She said, "I never want anyone to experience that as a young child." And almost every family I encountered in Russia and the former Soviet republics had some horror story about World War II involving one member, or at least one member of their family. So it is ever present. And during the whole time I was there, I never heard anyone express any interest in war, none whatsoever. So in 1986, this is what shopping looked like under the Soviet system. And if you notice, all of the people who were doing the shopping are grandmothers and grandfathers. That's because it was mandatory for people 50 and under to be working. So it was left to the grandmothers and grandfathers to go around to the various stores because there were a lot of shortages to get food for the nightly meal. This is another example of how very few goods were available. Today, Moscow has the supermarkets that we enjoy, and every major city in Russia has the same. They even have the indoor shopping malls just as we do. So there isn't anything in Russia that they can't buy that you can buy here in Newton or Boston or any major American city. This was traffic in 1986. There was virtually no traffic, and this is a good example. There was only 17 million cars for a country of 300 million people. But today, traffic in Moscow is just like any major city, horrific. So here are 3 Soviet women. And if you notice the demeanor on their face, So I would say to them, ladies, why don't you smile? And they would say to me, Henry, if you lived here, you wouldn't smile either. But that only tells part of the story. The story was that under communism, anyone who showed any emotion, both positive and negative, might draw a question, what's going on with you? So to avoid any questioning, they all learned to go through their daily lives with a pretty neutral face on themselves. But if you had these three women in their apartments among family and friends, they're every bit as vivacious as any American woman or European woman anywhere. To me, one of the great achievements under communism was education. When they took over in 1917, 95% of the country was illiterate. Today, it's the exact reverse. But during the collapse of communism, at a time of tremendous chaos, the teachers every day were in the schools, the children are in the schools learning. And even though at times teachers went months on end without being paid, I thought it was a real tribute to the dedication of the teachers. This is one of the icons of Soviet hockey. He scored the first goal in that famous series in '72 between Russia and Canada. And I used to play a lot of tennis with him over in Moscow. And you see, he has the Soviet demeanor on his face. And yet, he has one of the liveliest personalities of anyone I've ever met. One of the more iconic places in Moscow is this, the Church of St. Louis the French. And it's ironic because it was never closed by the communists beginning in 1917. But more ironic to me was its location. It was directly behind the KGB building in Moscow. Another iconic was these mineral water fountains that were everywhere. And so under communism, you would put a kopeck in, the glass would fill with mineral water, then you would take your drink. When you're finished, you put the glass back for the next person. It was interesting to note that after communism collapsed, these machines also collapsed. Another tradition of communism was Subotnik. Subotnik meant on the first clear Saturday in the spring after the snow had been removed, people would receive a note on their apartment door. Report tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for Subotnik, which meant to work to clean up the debris left by the snow. So everyone would report to the front of their apartment building, be handed a shovel, a rake, or some other tool, and or flowers or trees to plant. And so that would be the spring cleanup. It is a tradition that did not survive communism. So how did I get there? I was there in 1986 for the World Hockey Championships with a small group of tourists from Boston. We were there when Chernobyl happened. We were not told about it, nor was anyone told on the day it happened. But one of my group was in Red Square that Saturday afternoon, and he said, I don't know what's going on, but he said limousines were speeding in and out of the Kremlin. Well, we later found out the next day when we flew to Finland that Chernobyl had happened. And the people in Finland were really concerned because there was a radioactive cloud heading across Russia to Finland. So the following week, I was in Boston. I was in the book publishing business. And I'm watching the Today Show, and here is a young Soviet diplomat explaining to Congress what was happened at Chernobyl and that it was safe and they had everything under control. And in the bio, it said he spoke perfect English and they had lived in Washington for 5 years. And I thought, that might be an interesting book for him to write comparing living in Washington and living in Moscow. So I called him up, and I'll never forget his response to me. Who are you? What do you want? And I told him, and he said, that's pretty interesting. He said, I'd like to do it, but I can't get permission myself. So he said, let me see if I can get permission and call me tomorrow. So I called him the next day. He received permission to do the book. We talked about a contract, came to an agreement pretty quickly. And he said, well, why don't you come down tomorrow? We'll meet at the embassy, we'll sign the contract, and we'll get going. So my wife and I flew down to Washington the following day. We had a meeting at 9 o'clock at the embassy. So I said to my wife, would you like to come with me? And she said, I wouldn't go near that place with a 10-foot pole. I said, well, I'm going over. So over I went, and we met. And the embassy at the time was the former Pullman estate, Pullman Railroad Cars, and was right near the White House. So our meeting took place in the ballroom with all gold and glass. It was a beautiful room. Well, we talked for 2 hours, we signed the contract, but the more we talked about the book and other things, we kind of just hit it off as two people. So at the end of the conversation, I said to him, I told him the story about my wife, and he smiled and he said, why don't you go get her? And he said, I'll give her a private tour of this beautiful building. So I went back and got my wife. And as we approached the embassy, there he was standing on the front steps. And he said, come on in, Mary, there's nothing to be afraid of. And he indeed gave her a great tour. That night we had dinner with his wife, celebrating the signing of the contract. So he started writing the book, and we would periodically meet in New York or Washington. Excuse me. He was forbidden to come to Boston because it was outside the circle of allowance for travel for Soviet diplomats. But one day, a couple of months into the project, he called me and he said, I can't tell you anything, but I've just been ordered back to Moscow. When I get settled, I will call you. And of course, I'm thinking I'll never hear from him again. But sure enough, 3 months later, he called me. He said, again, I can't say anything on the phone, but he said, there's a ticket for you at the embassy. Come on over and we'll see where we go with this book. So over I went, and he was one of the planners of Perestroika. And among other things, he said to me, there's going to be a lot of changes here and good opportunity. Why don't I'll introduce you to some people and see if you see any interest. Well, he introduced me to a group that was publishing the first telephone book in Moscow. So I joined that group, and we indeed published the book. But he said to me also at one of our meetings, he said, I'm concerned about what the future holds. And if the government changes, he said, I want to get out. I want my kids educated in the West. And so when communism collapsed, he went and became an ambassador to Chile. Then he went on to be ambassador to NATO, to Belgium, to Canada, and in 2016, the Russian ambassador to the UN. And in 2016, we'll pick up when we had dinner in New York. So this is the Kremlin. The Kremlin means fortress. It's 120, 30 acres. The long white building you see contains what they call the Kremlin palaces. And that some of those started being built in the 15th century. On the right, you'll see those onion domes. Those stand over small cathedrals, and that's where the Tsars were baptized, married, and buried. In the background is a semicircular roof you can see. That's government offices. That's where Putin would have his office. And there's a brick wall with the towers on the corners all around the whole Kremlin. In the palaces, there are 5 palaces in that white building we just saw, and this is one of them. They've all been refurbished, and they are absolutely spectacular. Here are the golden doors you often see Putin coming through. Here's another one. They're all ceremonial rooms. This one here, if you notice the floors are not marble, but they're all inlaid wood, highly polished. In this particular room is probably the most ornate of all of them. It has 10,000 light bulbs. Outside of the Kremlin in Red Square is Lenin's tomb. So when communism collapsed, they said, what are we going to do with Lenin? So while they debated what to do with it and the building, much to their surprise, the tourists kept coming, both Russian and foreign. So every day you go to Lenin's tomb, you're going to see a line of Russians and foreigners lined up to look at Lenin. And you go in, you go down some stairs, and you can walk around the sarcophagus, and there he is. And he looks very lifelike. They take him out every 2 or 3 months, touch him up, put him back in. At one end of Red Square is St. Basil's Cathedral. This was built in the 16th century and ordered to be built by Ivan the Terrible. And in keeping with his name, when the cathedral was finished, he had the architect's eyes removed, so he couldn't reproduce it anywhere in the world. Another one of the major beautiful buildings in Moscow is the Bolshoi Theater. Under communism, you could go and buy a ticket for anywhere from 50 cents to $1, $1.25. Today, it is just like Broadway, $100, $500, whatever the particular ballet is showing. This building also has been all done over, and this is one of the foyers. And this is inside the theater. Truly one of the great theaters in the world. The pride of Moscow is their subway. All 160 odd stations are different. And if you look at the floor there, it's not for picture clean. It's clean like that all the time. They take very good care of it. To me, the best feature of their subway system was during rush hour, the trains came every 25 or 30 seconds. So it was very efficient to move around that city by subway rather than car. So a lot of the stations had mosaics, which are something about World War II or the Great Patriotic War or some achievement of communism. There's one about the end of World War II. There's another one. Another one. They're all different, all works of art. So I was there when McDonald's opened in 1990, and of course it was built by a group of 10 Canadian businessmen. But prior to its opening, there was a lot of pro and con back and forth between the Russians. Some said, what will the little children of Moscow, will they like a Big Mac? And then a whole lot of them would say never. And of course, here's the result. Here's a better picture. McDonald's is up on the left, and this line winds all the way around Pushkin Square. So that if you came to the end of this line, you're going to wait about 5 hours, and many did. These lines lasted almost a year. So little Olga and Dmitry could get a Big Mac. So the skyline of Moscow in 1988, 99% of all the Russians lived in apartments. And there was buildings 5 stories up to 12 or 14 stories. This is what they're building today. It looks very much what you see in downtown Boston or any major city in the West. And of course, they have the suburbs with the single home developments, the townhouses, the mansions, and McMansions, a full complement of housing. There were, in 1988, there were 7 of these, what they call Stalin skyscrapers. They're all exactly the same, 32 stories in height. This particular one was the Moscow State University. Others were the Foreign Ministry, Ukraine Hotel, an apartment building, office building, and other uses. This is Moscow's high-rise office buildings today, just like any major city, 60, 70-story glass towers. One of the more interesting places that I went to was the Masandra Winery. So this winery was down in Yalta and in the Crimea, and this sits on a side of a mountain that goes down to the Black Sea. Below it, this is about 3/4 of the way up. Below it are sanatoriums and hotels for vacationers on the Black Sea. It was built to supply and keep a collection for the Tsars. But in 1917, when the communists took over, they nationalized as many wine collections as they could find, and they shipped them here to Masandra Winery for safekeeping. In World War II, when the Nazis approached the Crimea, they wrapped up 800,000 bottles and sent them to Siberia for safekeeping. After the war was over, they brought them back. The clean bottle you see in this picture is part of the Tsar's collection. The others represent part of those collections that they nationalized. And even today, when they need money, they'll take some of these bottles and send them to London for wine auctions. And they make their own red sweet wine. And this is the cooling room. As you can see, it goes back into the mountain. So in April of 1991, I was sitting in my office in Boston and with my cousin Dave. And my secretary came in and she said, "Henry, the White House is on the phone." And I said, "You know, Jane, you don't have to impress my cousin." And she laughed and said, "No, really, the White House is on the phone." So I got on the phone. It was Susan Porter Rose, Mrs. Bush's chief of staff. And she said, "The president has asked me to call you, and we want you to solve a problem that the president and Mrs. Bush have." And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" And she said, "Well, there's two of them. The president and Mrs. Bush are going to donate the statues, Make Way for Ducklings, to the people of Moscow. And the contractor who's going to erect them in Moscow has requisitioned the biggest plane in the world, the C-5 transport, to take these ducks over to Moscow. And the president is outraged. That's going to cost $5 million, and he's not going to do it. So you have to find a cheaper way of doing it." And the other problem is we want the book published in Russian. And we're told you can do that too. So here are your two charges. So I called the contractor in Lexington and I said, "What are you taking to Moscow that you need the biggest plane in the world to take?" And he said, "Well, I'm taking trucks, water, sand." I said, "Wait a minute. Where the hell do you think you're going? They have trucks, they have sand, they have water." Well, make a long story short, the ducks went over in the cargo part of a passenger plane, and his workers went as passengers. And there they are in Moscow today, exact duplicates of what's in Boston. And if you went there to see them, you would see young Russian families taking pictures of their children sitting on these ducks. And people are people, so that nothing changes. There they are in Boston. Nancy Schroen, the sculptress, made a duplicate set that exists in Moscow. And here's the book in Russian, only printed a few for the ceremonies. But Robert McCoskey came over, who's the author, and of course he was thrilled to see it in Russian. As a result, the president invited me to a dinner that he gave to President Gorbachev in Moscow. And what I remember most about that dinner are these two people. The man on the left, Sergei Akrameyev, is the Marshal of the Soviet Army, and on the right, of course, Gorbachev. 2 weeks after the dinner, the Soviet Union collapsed. So major changes hitting these two men and how they dealt with them totally different. The Marshal committed suicide, and he left a note and he said, "I have devoted my life to communism and I cannot exist under any other system." On the right, Gorbachev, he lost his power, his residence, everything. And he didn't miss a beat. He left the president's office, and within a day or two, it created a environmental think tank, which still exists today. So it was the beginning of the end about the time of the dinner. And this is a scene with 2 million people on the streets of Moscow. And what to me happened was that the Russian people were brought up to believe they had the best there was in the world. And they could get away with that because they controlled information. But once information started seeping in, and the sources were Westerners traveling to Europe, to Russia, brought in magazines and books, newspapers, and Russian citizens started traveling more in exchanges to the West. Then television started to seep into Estonia from Finland. Well, it finally became common knowledge that they didn't have the best in the world. As a matter of fact, one man I knew over there had fought and been wounded in the Battle of Berlin. And he said to me one day, "What the hell did we fight for?" He said, "The Germans live better than we do." So the people knew it, so they were demonstrating for change. They were fed up with the food shortages and shoddy goods and no consumer products. Members of the power sections of the communist government, KGB and military, a few of those decided to stage a coup. And they arrested Gorbachev and ordered the army into Moscow to put down any public uprising. They did that on a Sunday night. Monday morning, I'm walking to work, and here come the tanks. They ordered 700 tanks into Moscow and thousands of troops. But as I'm walking along and watching these tanks, it became apparent to me something wasn't right because the tanks were stopping for red lights. And sure enough, when they got down to Red Square, the tanks wouldn't fire on the people. And that ended the coup right then and there. So here are people climbing up on the tanks, thanking the soldiers for not firing on them. And the leaders of the coup were all arrested, and Gorbachev was released. Here's another one on a tank behind Red Square. Yeltsin, at this time, was president of the Russian Republic within the Soviet Union. He had the wherewithal to climb onto a tank that went to the Parliament building. And he said he was going to declare the end of the Soviet Union and the emergence of Russia as a new republic. And it was a brilliant move by him. And if you notice, there's maybe about 7 or 8 people on the tank. After all this happened, when I would have business meetings, I used to ask Russian businessmen, "Where were you when the tanks were in the streets?" Invariably, they would say to me, "I was on the tank with Yeltsin." Well, I probably had more than 100 people tell me that one, but you can see there are only about 7 or 8 of them. So that was the end of communism, the emergence of the new Russia. To me, the most extraordinary fact of this whole thing was that communism in Russia collapsed without any bloodshed. I had been well aware of the control that the Communist Party exercised over every segment of Russian life. And to see it disappear in virtually 24 hours without any bloodshed was truly extraordinary. No one wanted to defend it. Government officials that I knew on Sunday were dedicated communists. Monday morning became Democrats and new capitalists. It was that quick. A couple of years later, there was one more revolution or rebellion where the communists seized members of parliament as hostages. And this time, Yeltsin called in the tanks, but this time they fired. And they killed 30 odd people in this parliament building. And that coup attempt ended in about 3 days. That's the fire started by the tanks. So a lot of people ask me to compare Putin and Stalin, both autocrats, but many differences. Stalin killed millions of people on his orders, but admirers of Stalin, because primarily of World War II, will tell you that he died owning a pair of one uniform pair of glasses, two pair of shoes, and a book. Whereas Putin, an autocrat, uh, no one has ever accused him of killing millions of people. There is some people alleged that he's ordered some deaths, but nothing on the scale of Stalin. But their dachas tell another story too. So here is Stalin's dacha. It is now a museum. It was in Sochi, and it was painted green because it was in the forest, and it was to hide it from German bombers in World War II. Here is Putin's new dacha. This is bigger than Buckingham Palace. Cost 1.3 billion to build. And it was only discovered when Alexei Navalny, the rebel leader currently, hired a helicopter, went up and took this picture. And he is now in prison in Siberia. It sits on 700 acres over the Black Sea. So here in the foreground, this oblong white shape is a heliport. To the left of it, the green mound, you see that's actually the roof of a hockey rink because Putin is quite a hockey player. On the right is a building where the staff lives and works. And then, of course, the main building. And then underneath the main building is a tunnel out to the cliff where there's a porch out there, in a glass porch, so that they can sit out there and enjoy the sea. So Navalny must have paid a workman to get some pictures inside because he obtained these pictures. This is the game room. That's the theater. That's the pool. So Vladimir Putin, I am currently preparing another presentation on him, but let me briefly give you what I think in a nutshell. He is an autocrat who proved that corruption and competency can coexist, and that's true. His popularity at the highest point was 85%, and now sits around 60%. And after the problems with Navalny and the demonstrations in the streets, but the demonstrations were primarily young people, and his popularity did not change. It still remains 60, 61%. The reason is that he brought back Russian pride, and he did it two ways. He suppressed the terrorists in Chechnya, and he stood up to the West. One of the ways he stood up to the West and still stands up to the West is that when the Berlin Wall was ordered down, Foreign Minister of Russia, Chikavides, was, I think, negotiating with James Baker. And James Baker said, if you allow the wall to come down, we will make sure that NATO never sets up in a country adjoining Russia on Russia's border. And that was the agreement. Well, in 2004, the West forgot that agreement and allowed NATO to get to the Russian border. And Putin called them on it. And so Russia's country pride under Yeltsin was very poor because it was chaos. There was corruption on such a grand scale the world probably will never see again. And Yeltsin was a drunk, and everyone was making fun of him. But here comes Putin, and he did the things that Yeltsin couldn't do. And so he did bring back Russian pride. But also his competency. He was one of the first in the world leaders to recognize the challenges of global warming. So one of the things he did was he's expanded food production in the Far East because of global warming. Millions of acres are extending the farming season on millions of acres. Used to be June to September, which was not long enough, but now it's April to September. So last year, Russia, for the first time, became leading exporter of wheat in the world. And it's projected, if it continues with the global warming and the new acreage being released, that by 2050, Russia will be the leading food producer in the world, and a whole lot of other subsequent events. But also, he, again, recognizing global warming, he claimed 460,000 square miles of Arctic Circle containing oil, many minerals, and most importantly for him, he is engaged in opening up the Northern Passage, which in time will allow all goods shipped from Japan and China to go the Northern Passage 40% cheaper. And those goods will go to Europe, Canada, and America. And so he jumped right on it. That shows his competency. They have a fleet of 14 icebreakers, 2 of them are nuclear, work on. And last year was the first year they were able to get ships through year round. So that is something that's going to continue to expand. But one of the results of his expansion problems is this very unique issue, the autonomous Jewish oblast or region in the far east of Russia. There are only 2 territories in the world designated as Jewish. One is Israel, the other one is this, the autonomous Jewish oblast, set up by Stalin in 1954 as a homeland for Soviet Jews. At its height, there were about 55,000 Jews living there. And as you can see from the signage here, even today, the street signs and everything are in Russian and Yiddish. So when the Soviets were allowed to emigrate, most of the Jewish people in this region of Russia emigrated to Israel. So the result is about 1,500 Jewish people there today. And one of the major reasons that the Jewish population is now regrowing, and the whole area is regrowing, is because of the farming and the mining in the Far East region, as well as this bridge, first bridge ever built between Russia and China. And it's to carry the goods from the mining operations and farming operations. If you remember last year, all those soybeans from Iowa that Trump canceled, well, those soybeans are being grown in Russia now and sent into China. But today, if you went there, you'll see a menorah in front of the train station. This is the Jewish Community Center, still very active. Menorah out front, and this statue. There are several statues around the city, including the university, which are in the universities named in honor of the famous Jewish author Shalom Aleichem. And so he's very much a presence in the today life of the Jewish community district. Here is the military base, the farthest most northern military base within the Arctic Circle that Putin has just built. Here is one of his nuclear icebreakers. So he was long ahead of many of the Western leaders in reacting to global warming. So the Winter Palace, here is the Hermitage. This was the winter home of the Tsar. And again, in World War II, as the Nazis approached Leningrad, they wrapped up all of the collection, sent it to Siberia for safekeeping, 36 trainloads, and after the war brought it back. This is how they did it. They just took pictures out of the frames, wrapped them up. During this 900-day siege of Leningrad by the Nazi army, most of the city was destroyed and 1 million people died of starvation. But the Nazi army never stepped foot inside the city. Although the palaces and everything else have been reconstructed, started under the communist government, continued under Yeltsin and Putin today. Here's some of the rooms that have all been redone in the Hermitage. This is one of the entryways. The Tsar's throne room. Lots of malachite and semi-precious stones. The floors, again, the inlaid wood. Look at this corridor in the Hermitage. And if you can see up on the ceiling, those are all hand-painted works of art up there, all the way down the walls. And again, the elaborate floors, just magnificent building. There are 14 galleries, each one devoted to a country. So this one may be Germany, another one France, all the Western countries of art, Spain. There's another hall in the Hermitage. They have the biggest collection of original Rembrandts in the world. There's 12 of them. They have a special room just for the Rembrandts. Another one of my more interesting experiences there was with Wally Schirra. Wally was one of our original astronauts, and I published his book about his life in space. So I joined a group that was opening an American merchandise mart in Moscow in 1989. And we rented a building from the Soviet Space Research Institute. And as a result, I called Wally, who was living in La Jolla, California, and I said, Wally, would you like to come over to Moscow and cut the ribbon? And he said, I'd love to. So Wally came over. But when the Russians heard he was coming, they said to me, would Wally go out to Kyrgyzia? We have a secret space research institute. We'd like to show him some technologies that we're working on. And maybe Wally can convince NASA to buy them because we need some money. So when I asked Wally, he said, sure, I'd love to. So the next day after the opening, Wally and I, and this man, he was a Russian cosmonaut. And that's Nancy Keenan in the background. She is the daughter of the American ambassador to the Soviet Union in World War II, and then Wally on the left. So we went out to Kyrgyzia, Bishkek. It's on the border of China. Looks very much like Colorado, beautiful white-capped mountains in the background. We went on to the grounds of the Space Research Institute. And Wally and the cosmonaut and interpreter spent a couple of hours going in this big room with all these scientists and tables with their stuff on it. I didn't know what was going to happen. They did. After a couple of hours, Wally said to me, he said, you know, they're really nice people. He said, I'm shocked how far behind they are. So that night at dinner, Wally said to the cosmonaut, he said, you know, you can help me and the American Space Agency, NASA. We have a mystery. And the mystery is you sent up Gagarin. Now that I've talked to you, I don't consider Gagarin a cosmonaut because he never flew anything. He sat on top of a rocket and came down. But nevertheless, we sent up Shepard. Then you sent up 2 cosmonauts, we sent up 2, then you sent up 3. And we're sitting in Houston saying, how the hell did they send up 3 people in that spaceship? And the cosmonaut put a big smile on his face and said, Wally, when we go back to Moscow, I'm going to take you to Star City and I'll show you the spaceship. So we get back to Moscow. Outside of Moscow is Star City, which is where the cosmonauts lived, worked, and trained. Wally saw the spaceship, and that night at dinner, he said to me, this was unbelievable. He said, they took out the seats and put in a bench just to drive the American space program nuts, and they did. So there are 2 mysteries of Russia, the Amber Room and the Tsar's Jewels. The Amber Room is located in Catherine's Palace outside of St. Petersburg or Leningrad. The Nazis took control of this building when they invaded Russia. They went to the Amber Room, they dismantled it and sent it to Germany, where they put it on exhibition. As the war wound down, they took the exhibition down, and it has never been found. Every now and then you're going to read something where they have found it, but it's never been found. But the Russians have, and this is the original Amber Room, and the Russians have reproduced it based on old photographs and drawings. So if you go to Catherine's Palace today, you'll see the Amber Room. The other mystery is the Tsar's jewels. So in the Kremlin is a museum, and a lot of the artifacts of the Tsars are contained in the museum. This is, for instance, is one of his carriages. But the jewels in 1917, when the communists took over, they couldn't be found. And they were not found until 1922, when a former colonel in the White Army after the Civil War joined the staff of the Red Army. And he said, by the way, I know where the jewels are. And because he was on the staff of the Tsar's military advisor. So he tells the story that as the communists were approaching Moscow in 1917, the military leaders for the Tsar said, we're going to move you out of the Kremlin for a couple of weeks till we take care of these communists, and then we'll bring you back. So there's no need of moving everything, but what you're going to take your jewels, and for safekeeping, we're going to put them in the basement in your clothing trunks. So they wrapped his jewels in the clothing of the Tsar, put them in the trunk, and of course the Tsar never returned. But in 1922, when they, based on the colonel's information, went down and discovered them, there they were. And they're on display today in the Diamond Fund in the Kremlin Museum. And so this is a 180 carat diamond. This is the Tsar's crown, red, amber, ruby up on top. The Tsarina's crown, all diamonds. So here's another very interesting story. Father Sazak. In 1939, Pope Pius XII commissioned 5 Jesuits to enter Russia to convert it to Catholicism. I mean, just thinking about that is no small task. But in any event, they all entered through Poland. On day 1, 4 of them were captured and expelled from the country. Father Sazak made it to Moscow. He was captured, but he was put on trial as a Vatican spy and sent to Siberia for 20 years. He served his 20 years in a labor camp. He got out and they were kept within Siberia. So he rented a room in a city in Siberia, got a job as an auto mechanic. And after a year or so, he became head of the Auto Mechanics Union. One day, one of his associates said, we can write to America. And so he wrote to the Jesuits in Baltimore, where he was a member, and told them he was alive. And they said, well, we're very happy to hear that. You should know we had the Mass of the Dead for you a long time ago, but we will see what we can do about getting you out. So the group that negotiated the release of the U-2 pilot, Francis Gary Power, after they released him, they got to negotiate to release Father Sazak, and they did. He returned to Baltimore, where he took up teaching again for 20 years, and he wrote a book about his experiences, which I read. And I mean, surviving 20 winters in Siberia in a labor camp was quite a feat. So corruption. Corruption's on a scale that we can't even begin to comprehend as Americans. I always would generally say it was going to take a generation to cleanse that kind of thinking, but others have said to me, you're dreaming. It'll be 2 or 3 generations. So I can tell probably hours worth of stories about just corruption that I saw, but always, pictures worth 1,000 words. So this represents a small view of what was found in the Minister of Corruption's apartment in Moscow when it was raided. And in there was $160 million in cash. That gives you some idea. And that's not the biggest one that I know of. So it was just extraordinary. Russian mafia, where the mafia began and end is hard to, the government ends is hard sometimes to understand. They played a major role in that I could see in the acquisition of vast fortunes by the so-called original oligarchs. All of them had a trail of bodies and broken dreams behind their acquisition of fabulous wealth. But what I really knew most about the Russian mafia came from this man, Bob Levinson. He was the former head of the Russian mafia unit, and he actually put in prison in America the head of the Russian mafia, who came here to run a gasoline scam. But Bob and I, after I left Moscow, used to talk in seminars, and he could talk for hours about various stories. But in 2007, after he retired, he was doing consulting involving a lot of companies in Russia, and he was doing some consulting about money laundering and between Russian and Iranian banks. And he went into Iran undercover as a film photographer for a Canadian film crew. Someone tipped off the Iranians and he was captured in 2007. This was the last known picture of him in 2014. Every president has tried to get his release to no avail. And lo and behold, his name popped up a couple of weeks ago with this Matt Gaetz fiasco, where two promoters went to Gates's father and said, if you give us $25 million, we can get Bob Levinson released from Iran. But that proved to be bogus. His family believes, and I believe, that he's probably dead. I mean, that's a long time in prison. So now we're back to 2016. So this is a picture of Vitaly as the Russian ambassador when he was appointed in 2000 to the UN. In 2016, we had dinner in New York, and all of our dinners over the years would always revolve around not politics, but family and travel. He was a tremendous booster of the American National Park system. And he had been to many, many of them. But in any event, at the dinner, I said to him, just a comment of a throwaway question. This is August of 2016. What do you think of Donald Trump? And he said to me, all I can tell you is that Trump, I had lunch with some Trump supporters today who tell me that some emails are going to come out about Hillary, they're going to hurt her. And he said, that's all I know. And so subsequent to that dinner, I told that story to a friend of mine in the FBI, and next thing I know, I'm being interviewed by two agents about it. And they told me that they had him under surveillance, so they would track down who those people were at the lunch. I had many encounters with the FBI over the years, starting with when the first day I went in, or the second trip to the embassy in Washington. Two agents came into my office one day and said, what are you doing going into the Soviet embassy? And I told them I was going to publish a book, and they said, can you prove it? And I showed them the contract, and they left. And then about 6 months later, another agent called me and said, we know you're going over to the Soviet Union, and we want to talk to you. So two more came in, and they said, when you go over, we want you to come back and talk to us. And I said, no. I said, I'm not really interested because it is such chaos over there. It's hard for me to really translate to you the chaos. And I said, no one has ever asked me anything about America, about the government, nothing, not even close. And so I declined. And another 6 months, two more came in. And then a year went by, and a woman called me one day, and she said, "This is Sally, whatever her name was, from the FBI," and she said, "We have a new program for uh, publishers in Russia and former Soviet countries." And I said, "Well, that sounds interesting." So she said, "Can I come and see you?" I said, "Sure." So she came in, sat down. She says, "Actually, we don't have a program. What we do want to do, we know that you know uh, various intelligence gatherers." I said, "We've been through this so many times, but okay, give me a name and I'll tell you what I think, and you tell me what you think." So she gave me a name, and I said, "Okay, I know him." And I said, "Here's my opinion. He is a retired former Soviet diplomat. He's looking at a pension of about $200 a month. And he's desperate. How is he going to support his family?"
I'm going to Schwartz's Hardware now to get 2 little cans of paint.
So uh, I said, "I can't." And she said, "Well, he was a known intelligence guy." I said, "He may have been, but sure as hell he's not doing it now." So I sent them on my way. So there is Vitali after, that's the 2016 picture. So the good life has taken its toll on him. And unfortunately, 2 months later, he died at his desk of a heart attack. So in 2018, I went to Moscow with Mary, and we had dinner with his wife. And we went into this Dr. Zhivago restaurant, and that classroom in the back there was really intriguing to me. So I looked in, and there was a young man in his 30s in a black t-shirt. And I said, "Wow, what a great marketing tool," because I perceived him to be mafia with his one girlfriend. And the mafia, I do know, wants to be seen, but also want to be protected. So I thought that was a wonderful. During the dinner, Irina, Vitali's wife, let out just in general conversation how her next door neighbor and their dacha was Vladimir Putin. So that gave you an idea. And sure enough, at his funeral, Vladimir Putin was sitting in the front row. So my last story is I was there when they filmed this Russia House. This was Sean Connery and Michelle Pfeiffer. So I, on one of my trips, went to New York, and I had lunch with a friend of mine. He brought along a friend of his who was the husband of Michelle Pfeiffer's agent. And he'd tell the story of Michelle Pfeiffer on her way back to LA from making the movie, stopped and had dinner with them. And he said, I said to Michelle, "Oh, how'd you like making the movie in Moscow?" She said, "I loved it. It was great. Met the people are wonderful. I saw some great things." He said, "Okay, what was the hardest part of making a movie in Moscow?" She said, "Oh, that's the easy one. That was keeping John Connery out of my bedroom." And they're there on the scene from the movie. So I end with this 3-minute clip of a concert in Red Square, and compare the people in the dress to those 3 Soviet women I showed you. So I will answer any questions you may have.
Henry, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yep.
And then I can see who's might have a hand up. Just in case. There we go. Okay, first one I saw was Bill Leach.
Hi, am I on?
Yep.
Okay, Henry, I got a story about an American publisher in Moscow. For some 20 years, I was with the publisher of Computer World, here founded here in Newton on Washington Street above the Chinese restaurant.
Right.
We established publications in France, Britain, and even China. So we wanted to get into this new private enterprise Soviet state, and managed to get a permit to have a computer conference and computer show in what was the Park of Soviet Economic Achievement.
I know it well.
Yeah. And we had something like 24 American manufacturers who wanted to get joint venture and distribution relationships. So we had a pretty good computer show, not any advanced integrated circuit type equipment,
Yeah.
but still things which were, to our opinion, far more advanced than anything that was in use in Soviet business or economic enterprises.
Right.
So I led the conference, and we had as a leading speaker one of the professors at MIT Sloan School, who happened to be a Russian extraction, would make a great keynote speak on information technology in administration. Well, I think administration in the beginning of perestroika was still conducted on the abacus. We had
Yeah.
probably 40,000 people came to the computer show. They had no money, so they didn't buy anything, but it was a great critical success. We
Yeah.
had the experiences of being spied upon, taken around in tourist buses,
Yeah.
and it was a fascinating attempt to try to get into this environment. Maybe we didn't pay off enough of the mafia, but basically there were a few commercial relationships developed, and that was really the end of my activity with ventures with Soviet publishers.
Well, a little note on the technology at the time. If a company, and very few were, had a Xerox machine, it was kept under lock and key, and only the director could authorize the making of one copy.
Mm.
I mean, it was just incredible with the lack of technology.
Yes, we saw that difference. Couldn't imagine how the Soviets had managed to build intercontinental ballistic missiles and do Sputnik with the abacus.
Well, I'll give you one footnote to that story. When Wally and I were standing in the airport leaving, Wally turned to me and he said, he said, these guys have pulled off the biggest con job in history. What in God's name were we afraid of?
Correct.
All for running up the tab in Congress.
Yeah. Go ahead, Douglas.
Hi, thank you very much, Henry. That was extraordinary. What amazing photographs that you have
Thank you.
in slides. That's tremendous. We had the experience of being in the Soviet Union in '75 with a State Department tour, my wife and I, and we were informed. We could kind of tell who was CIA on the trip, because our guide was very much keeping an eye on them. But we also had heard that when a Russian speaks very good English, they've almost certainly been educated in the KGB. So I was wondering if your friend Vitaly Churkin, was it?
Yes,
was
Churkin, yeah.
If that fits with your understanding, and also
Well,
his
I know
friendship
he
with
went
Putin.
to the school, but I asked him, I said, how'd you learn? He said, well, I learned English in school, but he said, when I was in Washington, he said, every spare moment I was watching American television. And he said, I
Uh-huh.
think that helped me more. But to your point, when he was buried and at his funeral, he was laid out in a general's uniform
Uh-huh. Okay.
that no one ever knew he had that kind of a rank. So
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
lends credence to your story.
yeah. Mysteries within mysteries. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions, comments? I think, yeah, Audrey, I know you want to say something. You need to unmute yourself. Nope.
Still muted.
Yeah. Audrey, you're still muted. Do you know how to type it in the chat? If you click on chat, you can type in it. But are you on an iPad, Audrey, or on a computer? Are you on an iPad? Give me a thumbs up if you're on an iPad. No, she's on a computer. Oh, boy. Okay. Okay. I'm going to ask you to unmute. And there should be a place for you to click when I say unmute.
She can also just press the space bar if she
Oh,
has a
Audrey.
laptop
Hold down the space bar on your computer
and talk.
and talk. No.
Oh, well.
Oh, boy. Aw, all right. Sorry about that. I know, but I can tell you that I know that Audrey and her husband were in the Soviet Union, I think in the 60s, Audrey, is that what you told me, in the 60s? So she was there in the 60s. So, and I'm sure that was something she wanted to talk something about that.
Yeah.
So that was before both of you.
Yes.
Well, while we're organizing, Audrey, Henry, can you tell us a little bit more about this amazing story of food production in the eastern part of the?
Yeah, I was turned
former
on
Soviet
to
Union?
it by an article in the New York Times where their environmental people went to the Far East. And one of the big issues was two sources. One of the big issues was the financing. And China is financing the expansion of the farming. They are still struggling to get people out there. And they're very particular about who they're. So Putin has offered all kinds of incentives for financing to Russians to move out there to take on the farming. But at some point, they're going to have to drop the bars and bring in immigrants because the required number of people to raise to the top of being world producers, leading world producers of food is enormous. So, but that's where they're projected to have that kind of land available. And it's also global warming, extending then they have the environmental, a lot of the permafrost is releasing more carbon into the air as that's melting. So, but to me, with the global warming making a lot of the Middle East and Southeast Asia uninhabitable because of heat.
Yeah.
There are only two countries can absorb a lot of people, Canada and Russia.
Interesting.
So a lot of changes are afoot. And I don't know, if Egypt will lose more than half their revenue from the Suez Canal, that'll have a devastating impact on them.
Yeah.
So a lot of changes are afoot that we're really, and unfortunate for us, we have so many people denying global warming exists, and one of the problems with democracy.
Yeah.
All right, Audrey, you're in.
I unmuted.
Yes.
By pressing my cursor on the unmute button. It didn't like my finger, but it took the button.
Okay.
Okay, well, first, I just want to say thank you very, very much. It was wonderful. One thing I missed was more of the Malachite room.
Excuse me?
I said one thing I really missed was one more of the Malachite room.
Yeah. That was
big
fabulous.
bird, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
decided I could be buried in one, of course.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very, very much.
You are.
I also have stories, but they're different. Not tomorrow.
So I have two questions. My first one actually is Stalin. It's Stalin who's in the perpetual state in his tomb, right?
Lenin.
Lenin, thank you.
They took out Stalin. He was in there and they took him out.
Okay, so that's his actual body that they take
Yes,
out.
yes.
And how do they preserve it if they open it to
Yes.
air every few years or months or whatever it is? How can they keep it preserved? Oh, you froze. There you go.
You're breaking up. I
Oh.
can't hear you.
I asked,
You're frozen, Amy.
oh, I am?
Can I,
Oh, boy.
Amy, you're breaking up.
Okay. I'm gonna chat. Yeah, okay.
Well, he's preserved. It's airtight. And it's a group of just sort of yeah, right.
So I missed everything you said. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, well, what I said was that it's airtight and they have whatever technique they have or technology. It's the same technology that has Go Chi Minh in China, and then they went to North Korea and did him too. So they perfected this technology.
Okay, okay. My second question actually is because you talked about him, Putin being way ahead of everyone else on climate change.
Right.
That he's accessed 240,000+ acres in the Arctic.
Miles.
Thank you. In the Arctic, which you said has a lot of oil.
Right.
I can't imagine that he would use that for drilling. He would want to be drilling in that area because that then completely defeats his purpose of trying to be ahead on climate change.
They are in fact drilling as we speak. And they also are perfecting what they call green oil.
Huh.
So, and vast minerals, my woman mentioned earlier, malachite and huge storage of diamonds and other carbon related materials up there. So there's 2 million Russians living within the Arctic Circle.
Oh,
But to me, the biggest impact is going to be opening up that Northern Passage for
mhm.
shipping. Because they're all going to have to pay Russia.
Right. Okay.
And then coupled with the food, so that's the future of Russia. They're going from an extraction economy to something else.
Mhm. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Anybody else? Comments, questions? Going once. Going twice. All right. Henry, thank you so much. This was fabulous. I was
Thank
so
you, Amy.
engaged
Thanks.
the whole time. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, really
Thank
excellent.
you.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Keep
Amy,
us notified if you, on your next book.
I will. Okay.
Thank you
All right.
so much.
Thank you. Have a
Take
good day.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Bye-bye.
Stay well, everyone. Great to
Thank
see you.
Amy, did you tape this
Yes,
talk?
I did.
So will it be, because I would like to hear it again, because I missed some.
Yeah, I
Um,
will figure that out with Dave.
Oh, okay. All
All
right.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.
bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.